they're going to move a lot of their manufacturing business to Mexico. I'm just notifying John Deere right now. If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States, so that if I win, John Deere is going to be paying a 200%.
Would this be the move that changes the country's agricultural sector forever? In less than 30 seconds, Donald Trump declared economic war. Not on China, not on Mexico, but on one of the most iconic American companies in history. To John Deere, it was just making a move it thought was survival. But why does this look like betrayal in Trump's America First playbook? And more so, why is that betrayal cutting deep for millions of Americans? Keep watching, because today's video will show you what this all means for your kitchen and your food storage. Just days before Trump's threat, John Deere quietly confirmed something massive. It was expanding operations, not in Iowa, not in Illinois, but in Mexico, a $55 million manufacturing facility, new production lines, new jobs, south of the border, not in theory, not in 5 years. Construction begins now and operations launch by 2026. For Deere, it was about efficiency. For Trump, it was a red line. Standing in front of a crowd in Iowa, he called it a spit in the face of American workers. And then came the hammer, a threat to slap a 200% tariff on every piece of equipment Deere builds outside the United States. The message wasn't subtle. You take the jobs out, we'll make sure your machines can't come back in without paying a political price. Cable news ran it on loop. Twitter exploded. Talk radio dialed in with rage. And in small towns across the Midwest, where Deere is more than a brand, it's practically family, the move felt personal. Was this just business, or had Deere crossed a line? Behind the scenes, company reps scrambled to clarify. This new facility, it would only handle compact loaders, a small fraction of their product line. Big tractors and harvesters, still made in the USA, but nuance doesn't go viral. And by then, the damage was already done. Behind the noise, behind the headlines, behind Trump's fiery threats, sat a whiteboard in a John Deere boardroom covered in numbers, graphs, charts, supply chain projections, labor cost curves. This wasn't ideology, it was survival. Over the past 24 months, manufacturing in the US didn't just get more expensive, it became unpredictable. Finding skilled welders, machinists, or electronics technicians wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible in some rural plants. The labor pool dried up, retirement surged, and younger workers weren't lining up to replace them. At the same time, supply chain delays became routine. Parts that once arrived in 5 days were now stalled for 5 weeks. US ports backed up, freight routes jammed, materials sat on docks, idle. Every delay meant missed quotas, stressed margins, and frustrated customers. Shipping costs skyrocketed, raw material prices spiked, even domestic transport, trucking between Midwest facilities, became chaotic. The American system, once streamlined, had become sluggish. But here's the question no one in Washington wanted to ask. What if the real threat to American manufacturing isn't betrayal, but basic math? Meanwhile, rivals like Kubota and Mahindra were running lean. Their operations, rooted in Asia and South America, were built for volatility. They had lower labor costs, fewer logistics issues, and faster distribution pipelines. They weren't waiting for the storm to pass, they were moving through it at speed. Deere was falling behind, and they knew it, and that's when Mexico came into the discussion. To Deere, it wasn't betrayal, it was triage. Mexico offered 3 lifelines US operations couldn't. Labor costs 70% lower, with a workforce trained in precision manufacturing, geographic access to booming Latin American agriculture, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, where demand for compact, affordable farm equipment was soaring, logistical relief from clogged US systems, faster transport, smoother exports, and more predictable timelines. So Deere pulled the trigger, a $55 million investment into a facility in Monterrey, a smart plant for smart machines with compact loaders and skid steers, targeting smaller farms that form the backbone of LATAM's agricultural growth. This wasn't about moving everything overseas, but what about big tractors, harvesters, and combines? They'll still be made in Illinois and Iowa, but to stay competitive, Deere needed flexibility. Mexico gave them that. Still, they miscalculated on one thing: emotion. Because no press release, no data point, no supply chain diagram could compete with the image of an American company moving jobs south. In the court of public opinion, optics beat economics. And that's when the narrative flipped, from strategy to scandal. scandal. But what came next was worse. The market didn't panic, it calculated. Within hours of Trump's televised threat, John Deere's stock took a modest dip, a brief signal of uncertainty. But by the next trading session, it rebounded. Analysts weren't shaken. If anything, they doubled down. Now, what if the scandal everyone's screaming about is the strategy Wall Street's quietly betting on? Goldman Sachs issued a note to investors calling the Mexico move a rational hedge against domestic volatility. In other words, Deere wasn't jumping ship, it was bracing for the storm. Bloomberg was even more direct, describing the decision as forward-looking, strategically sound, and globally necessary. Because the data was undeniable. Agriculture demand wasn't dying, it was moving south. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia were investing heavily in smart farming and high-output machinery, and Deere wasn't trying to get ahead of the curve, it was trying not to get crushed by it. Then came the irony: Trump's threat of a 200% tariffs, pitched as punishment for Deere's so-called betrayal, could actually boomerang. Why? Because while Trump's base viewed Deere's expansion into Mexico as a sellout, the company still manufactures over 95% of its North American equipment inside the US. Meanwhile, its competitors, Mahindra, Yanmar, Kubota, simply don't. Their supply chains are deeply rooted in Asia, so if the tariffs actually happened, they'd slam everyone. But Deere, with most of its production still domestic, might come out more competitive, not less. Still, the real fire wasn't on Wall Street, it was in the heartland. Talk radio hosts blasted Deere as traitors. Facebook feeds flooded with memes and boycott calls. Rural forums became battlegrounds. Some defended Deere, a company trying to survive in a brutal global market. Others demanded blood, loyalty to country over logic, and then Washington took notice. When outrage becomes policy, who's really pulling the levers? The voters or the politicians feeding them the fire? Senators from deep red farm states began issuing statements, warning Deere to reconsider. The House Agriculture Committee scheduled hearings to review foreign dependency in agricultural equipment. Even big names like Mark Cuban waded into the fray, and behind the scenes, the White House floated the idea of auditing government contracts to ensure no taxpayer money flowed to outsourced production. In DC, Deere lobbyists kicked into overdrive. They met with commerce and agriculture staffers. Their message was blunt: you tax Deere, you hurt the farmers who depend on them. Because this wasn't just corporate. Deere's equipment powers the infrastructure of rural America, the same voters Trump pledged to protect. But this was no longer just about one company's strategy. It was about something bigger, the struggle between political power and production logic, and the world was watching. This was never just about tariffs, or even about jobs. It's about something far deeper, a clash between memory and math. Who do we turn to when the symbol of rural resilience starts preparing for a future without rural workers at all? Trump stood on stage promising to bring American manufacturing back. Factories, jobs, pride. He painted a vision of a past that felt safe, familiar, solid. Red barns, rolling fields, blue-collar towns roaring back to life. But John Deere isn't looking backward. They're looking at a future that doesn't need workers, at least not the kind who swing wrenches or weld steel. What about the new factory in Mexico? It's a small tactical shift. The real play is already unfolding across fields in Iowa and Indiana, and it doesn't involve humans at all. Deere is pouring billions into autonomous tractors, AI-powered farm management systems, and drone-operated pesticide platforms. Smart software that controls entire operations from a touchscreen. Tractors that drive themselves, machines that make decisions in real time, where to plow, when to harvest, how to maximize yield with surgical precision. It's not about where equipment is made, it's about how it runs, and soon who even needs to run it. Because labor isn't being moved, it's being erased. A 2023 Oxford economics report estimated that up to 20 million manufacturing jobs will vanish by 2030 due to automation. Not because of outsourcing, but because of innovation. And John Deere isn't avoiding American labor. They're preparing for a future where American labor, as we know it, doesn't exist. This isn't politics. This is arithmetic. So while Trump shouts about betrayal, Deere is making bets on survival. And what happens to the people caught in the middle? They're not wrong to feel betrayed, but they might be looking at the wrong enemy. So here we are, two visions, one country. On one side, a populist warrior fighting to restore the old deal. loyalty for jobs, patriotism for prosperity. On the other, a global company, moving fast, calculating risk, evolving for a world that's already changed. John Deere isn't just rethinking where it builds, it's rethinking what it builds. The tractors of tomorrow won't just plow, they'll predict. They'll optimize, update, adjust, all without a single hand on the wheel. And for farmers in places like Nebraska, Missouri, and Ohio, that creates a new kind of tension. Not just about economics, but about identity. So do you stand with the candidate who says, I'll bring the jobs back, even if the jobs are gone for good? Or do you side with the company that's saying, we're building the future, with or without you? Technically, even if Deere brought every factory back to Iowa, the jobs still wouldn't come back. Not to humans anyway. That's the part no one says out loud. Because this isn't just a trade fight, it's a tech war disguised as a culture war. And the American farmer is stuck in the crossfire. Now, who pays the price? The company that adapts? Or the country that refuses to?